The road into the valley is narrow, barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass. It winds downward through pine and stone, following a stream that glints like broken glass in the morning light. For centuries, this road carried little more than pilgrims and traders, people who came quietly and left quietly. It's people who had no reason to fear being remembered. At the bottom of the valley stands what remains of the convent. Even before its fall, it was never grand, no towering spires, no jeweled altars. Just thick limestone walls, a squat bell tower, and narrow windows cut high enough to keep the cold out and the world at a distance. It was built to endure winters, not wars. The women who lived here chose that endurance deliberately. Most arrived young. Some were sent by families unable or unwilling to provide dowries. Others came after widowing, or after refusing marriages, arranged without consent. A few arrived alone, carrying nothing but a letter of introduction and the certainty that life beyond these walls offered them no protection at all. Inside, they found something rare for the age. Time that belonged to them. Days structured by bells, yes, but also by labor they controlled. Gardens they tended. Manuscripts they copied. Accounts they kept. They were poor by design, but not powerless. The convent owned land. It negotiated rents. It defended its boundaries in court. Abbesses signed documents that men were required to honor. That alone made it anomalous. Outside the valley, the world was changing. Borders shifted. Thrones fell. The Ottoman state expanded not only through conquest, but through administration. It absorbed territory the way water fills cracks, slow and unstoppable. At first, the convent barely noticed. The taxes arrived late one year, then earlier the next. New officials replaced old ones. Titles changed, seals changed. The language of authority became less familiar, more distant. Daily life continued. Bread was baked. Psalms were sung. The bell rang. What no one said out loud was that the convent existed because previous empires had tolerated it. Tolerance is not the same as protection. It is conditional, temporary, revocable. When the first surveyors arrived, they came without soldiers. They measured fields, counted olive trees, asked questions that sounded harmless. How many residents? How much land? What revenues? Everything was written down. That was the moment the convent ceased to be invisible, in imperial logic. Anything that can be counted can be reassigned. The abbess at the time was a woman named Erin. She had spent nearly 40 years within the walls. She knew the sound of every step on the stone floors, every creak of the doors in winter. She understood power well enough to recognize its approach long before it announced itself. She sent letters, carefully worded, respectful, precise. She cited charters, precedents, agreements made generations earlier. She did not plead. She reminded. The replies, when they came, were polite and non-committal. Acknowledgments without assurances. Promises of review. Delays that felt deliberate. Empires do not argue with institutions they plan to dissolve. They stall them, the soldiers. Arrived at dawn, weeks later than expected, and years sooner than feared. There was no battle. No resistance. None would have mattered. The commander dismounted calmly, removed his gloves, and handed over a document bearing an imperial seal. It was read aloud in a language only partially understood, then summarized in one that required no translation. The convent was no longer recognized as a legal entity. Its land reverted to the state. Its buildings were to be inspected, its residents redistributed according to administrative need. There was no mention of faith, no accusation of wrongdoing, no condemnation. It's just classification. For the women, this was the most terrifying part. Not violence, but reduction. To be turned from a community into a list, they were given hours to gather personal belongings. Books were inventoried and removed, ledgers seized, keys taken. The bell rope was cut and coiled like a dead thing at the base of the tower. Some women wept quietly. Others did not react at all. Shock often looks like composure. One by one, names were called, ages noted. Skills assessed: seamstress, herbalist, scribe, cook. Each descriptor narrowed a future. Younger women were marked for household service in nearby cities. Older ones for workshops or agricultural estates. A few, those with literacy or experience in management, were designated for state-run institutions where their abilities could be exploited. Under supervision, none were offered a choice. This was not cruelty. It was efficiency. The empire did not see itself as destroying lives. It saw itself as reallocating resources, human ones included. By sunset, the courtyard was empty. Footprints marked the dust where the women had stood hours earlier. The convent, stripped of purpose, felt smaller, hollowed out. That night, soldiers slept inside the walls. Fires were lit in the refectory. Laughter echoed where prayers once had. By morning, it was already no longer sacred. Within weeks, the land was reassigned. A local administrator moved into the abbess's quarters. The chapel was locked, the bell tower left to decay. Records show that within a decade, the convent no longer appeared on maps. What happened to the women afterward is harder to trace. Imperial archives are meticulous about intake, less so about outcomes. Names change, status shifts. People vanish into categories. One woman appears years later in a census as part of a textile operation. Another as a servant in a merchant's household. A third disappears entirely, her name never appearing again. This is how erasure works. It's not all at once, slowly, legally, quietly. What makes this story unsettling is not that it was unusual, but that it was ordinary. Similar dissolutions occurred across newly absorbed territories. Female institutions were particularly vulnerable because they challenged the basic assumption of patriarchal control. Women living collectively, managing property, answering to no husband or father, represented a flaw in the system, not a rebellion, but an alternative. And alternatives are dangerous. The empire could tolerate many forms of belief, could tolerate different languages, rituals, even laws. What it could not tolerate was a structure it did not control, so it dismantled them carefully, with documents, with seals, men who believed they were simply doing their jobs. Long after the convent fell, travelers wrote about the valley. They mentioned ruins, broken walls, an abandoned tower. Some noted the strange acoustics, how sounds seemed to linger there longer than expected. No one mentioned the women history often records as conquest, as noise, armies, cries, fire. But the most permanent damage is usually silent. It happens in offices, in ledgers, in decisions framed as administrative necessity. The bell that once defined life in the valley was never rung again. But its absence shaped everything that followed, because when a space for autonomy disappears, it does not leave a vacuum, it leaves a warning. And empires remember warnings very well. The women were scattered across the province like ash after a fire. No single destination, no shared future. That was intentional. Empires understand something instinctively. Groups can remember, but individuals are easier to erase. So the convents. Residents were never sent together. Sisters who had lived side by side for decades were separated within hours. Bonds carefully cultivated over a lifetime were treated as inconveniences, not realities. One woman, older than most, was assigned to an estate outside the city. The records describe her as past useful age for skilled labor, yet still capable of supervision. She became a watcher of others, a role stripped of authority but heavy with responsibility. She slept in a small room near the storage sheds. She was fed, clothed, and ignored. Another, barely 19, was sent into a merchant household. The document lists her simply as domestic. It does not record how many men lived there, how many commands she obeyed each day, or how often. She thought of the garden she once tended at dawn, hands and soil, breath her own. A third was reassigned to a state-run weaving operation. She had copied manuscripts for years, fluent in 3 languages, but literacy was irrelevant where thread moved faster than thought. Her fingers learned a different rhythm. The looms were loud. Conversation was discouraged. Silence increased productivity. None of these transfers were described as punishment. That is what made them effective. Punishment creates martyrs. Reassignment creates compliance. Back in the valley, the convent stones absorbed a new identity. The chapel was repurposed as storage. The refectory became an administrative hall. The cells where women had once slept in quiet discipline were knocked together to form larger rooms for men who rotated in and out with the seasons. Sacred spaces do not vanish instantly. They are overwritten. Sometimes locals would still walk past the walls and lower their voices out of habit more than belief. A few crossed themselves without thinking. Old reflexes die slowly, but children born after the conversion knew the place. Only as a government building, then later as a ruin. No one taught them what it had been. Years passed. The empire stabilized. Administrators came and went. The dissolution of the convent became a footnote, then less than that. A single line in a ledger marking the transfer of land ownership. This is how history decides what matters. The women who had lived there aged. Some died quietly, buried without markers. Others married, not always by choice, not always with consent. A few learned to survive by becoming indispensable. Survival, however, is not the same as freedom. What united them was memory, even scattered. They remembered the sound of the bell, the way the valley fog lifted in the morning, the rare intoxicating sensation of making decisions without permission. Memory is dangerous. It creates comparison. A comparison breeds dissatisfaction. So the empire did what empires always do, allowed memory to fade naturally through exhaustion and isolation, rather than trying to crush it outright. There were no prohibitions against speaking of the convent. No punishments for remembrance. There didn't need to be. When no one around you shares the memory, eventually you stop speaking it aloud. This pattern repeated across territories and generations. Female-run spaces disappeared one by one. Some were absorbed. Some were dissolved. Some were simply denied recognition until they collapsed under pressure. Official histories celebrated stability, tolerance, progress. They pointed to roads built, markets expanded, borders secured. And all of that was true. What they did not record was the cost paid by those whose existence complicated the system. Women who had governed themselves were turned into dependents. Women who had owned property were turned into wards. Women who had spoken collectively were turned into whispers. This was not accidental. Power does not fear strength as much as it fears autonomy. A woman obeying orders is predictable. A woman managing land, labor, and law without male oversight is not. She represents a question the system does not want asked. What if hierarchy is not natural but enforced? So the question was removed. Centuries later, historians would debate the empire's treatment of women. Some would argue it was progressive for its time. Others would note legal protections and inheritance rights that existed on paper. Both sides would cite evidence. Few would look for what had vanished, because absence is harder to prove than abuse. There is no monument marking the end of the convent, no plaque listing names, no chronicle describing the moment autonomy was extinguished. Just stones worn smooth by weather and footsteps that no longer remember why they walked that path. And yet, the silence itself tells a story. It tells us that power does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrives with forms, seals, and polite language. Sometimes it destroys not bodies but possibilities. The women who lived in the valley were not rebels. They did not challenge the empire openly. They did not take up arms. They simply existed in a way that contradicted the structure imposed around them, and for that, they were dismantled. This is why their story matters, not because it is unique, but because it is familiar. Because somewhere right now, institutions that give people agency are being quietly defunded, reclassified, absorbed, or dissolved. Not with cruelty, but with paperwork. Not with hatred, but with indifference. And one day, someone will walk past the ruins and wonder what once stood there. The children born in that valley after the convent's disappearance grew up with stories that felt unfinished. They heard fragments, never conclusions. An old woman muttering about bells that no longer rang. A shepherd who swore the hill was cursed, not because of demons, but because too much praying had soaked into the stone. A mother who warned her daughter not to wander near the ruins. At dusk, not out of fear, but unease she could not name. None of them were told the truth directly. Truth survives longest when it is disguised as superstition. Time moved the way it always does, forward without apology. Empires expanded, contracted, changed banners, languages shifted. Borders blurred and hardened again. The valley remained, patient and indifferent. Watching generations step where others had once knelt, the women who had been scattered carried the convent. Inside them, long after its walls were repurposed, they carried it in habits that made no sense to those around them. Rising before dawn, even when no one demanded it. Pausing before meals as if waiting for permission that would never come. Speaking softly, even when they were alone. Some tried to forget. Forgetting was easier than remembering something you were never allowed to reclaim. But forgetting leaves its own scars. Hollows people out in ways that obedience never can. One woman, now living in a port city far from the valley, married a dock worker. He was not unkind, only practical. Oh. He never understood why his wife cried when ship's bells rang, or why she refused to sleep past sunrise even in winter. He learned not to ask, another became indispensable to the household she served. She managed accounts, negotiated with suppliers, oversaw younger servants. Outsiders assumed she held power. She knew better. Authority borrowed can be revoked at any moment. A third disappeared entirely from records after a decade. No death entry. Contract, just absence. It's the most complete erasure of all. This is how women vanish from history.
It's not in flames, but in ellipses.
Meanwhile, the empire recorded its triumphs meticulously. Victories were dated, catalogued, praised, treaties preserved, rulers immortalized in stone and ink. The story moved forward, clean and linear. But beneath that surface, memory traveled. Differently, mothers passed gestures to daughters without explanation. The way to tie hair back before work, the habit of hiding bread for later, the instinct to listen before speaking.
How?
These were not teachings, it's just reflexes shaped by lives constrained. Cultural archaeologists centuries later would struggle to explain these patterns, why certain communities valued silence over expression, why women deferred even when no law required it, why collective female spaces were so rare, and when they existed so fragile, they would look for laws. They would look for battles. They would miss the quiet. Dismantling that happened in places like that valley, because dismantling does not leave ruins that scream. It leaves landscapes that look normal. The ruins of the convent eventually collapsed. Stones were taken to build homes. Wood beams burned for warmth. Oh, nothing was wasted. Sacredness was recycled into survival. A traveler passing through generations later might remark on the efficiency of it all. How nothing was left unused. How practical people were back then. He would not know what those stones once held. And perhaps that was the greatest success of the system that replaced it. Not that it destroyed the past, but that it made the past seem unnecessary. Yet memory has a way of resurfacing in unexpected forms. In the 17th century, a visiting cleric wrote briefly about an odd local custom. Women in the valley would gather once a year before dawn, standing in silence near the hill where the old building had stood. No prayers were spoken. No rituals performed. They simply stood until the sun rose, then dispersed. He dismissed it as folk behavior. Harmless, meaningless. He was wrong. They were remembering without words, because words had once made people targets. Silence had become the safest language. By the time modern historians arrived with notebooks and theories, the practice had faded. Only a few elders recalled it, and even they could not explain why it had begun. Tradition without context is easy to ignore, and so the story nearly disappeared. Nearly what? Saved it was not an official archive or imperial record, but inconsistency. A handful of mismatched documents, property transfer that did not align with population data, Sudden absence of female signatures and local agreements where they had once been common. Gaps. The days. Speak to those trained to listen, slowly, cautiously. Researchers began to reconstruct what had happened. Not in dramatic revelations, but in careful deductions. They pieced together the disappearance of autonomous female spaces across multiple regions, all following similar patterns: no massacres, no mass executions, just absorption, reassignment, dilution. The conclusion was unsettling. These women were not eliminated because they were weak, but because they were organized. They had proven that women could govern themselves, sustain communities, and exist outside male authority without chaos. That example could not be allowed to spread, so it was quietly removed. When this interpretation was first published, it faced resistance, not outrage, just discomfort. It complicated narratives of tolerance and progress. It forced readers to consider that oppression does not always wear a violent face. Sometimes it smiles and offers protection. The legacy of the convent is not found in relics or ruins. It lives in the long shadow it cast, in the narrowing of possibilities that followed, in the absence of women's voices where once there had been many. It lives in the instinct to lower one's eyes, in the belief that safety comes from invisibility, in the inherited caution passed from mother to daughter without explanation. And yet, something else survived too. The idea that autonomy once existed. Even when unspoken, that idea matters. Because once people know something existed before, they can imagine it existing again. Empires rise and fall. Systems replace one another. But memory, even fragmented, even distorted, carries seeds. The women of that valley were not remembered. By name, their faces were not preserved. Their words were not quoted. But their absence reshaped history, just as powerfully as any presence, and that is the final truth. This story leaves behind not that they were defeated, but that they were feared, enough to be erased.